The crystal wine glasses clinked as Flynn and I toasted our 5th wedding anniversary. The candlelight caught in his warm brown eyes, reminding me why I fell for him in the first place. 5 years of marriage, a beautiful daughter, and a life I'd built from scratch. Everything was perfect until the doorbell rang. I'm Edith, and this is the story of how my anniversary dinner turned into a battlefield. I'll get it, Flynn said, squeezing my hand before standing up. Probably the babysitter dropping off Marley early. I smoothed my black dress and took another sip of wine, savoring the peaceful moment. The sound of heels clicking against our hardwood floors made my blood run cold. I knew those steps. Darling! Victoria's voice carried through our dining room before she appeared, perfectly coiffed as always. Behind her, her new husband Truman smiled apologetically. Oh, are we interrupting something? Flynn shot me a concerned look. Victoria, we weren't expecting you. Nonsense. Family doesn't need an invitation. She swept into the room, her designer perfume overwhelming the scent of the lasagna I'd spent hours preparing. Besides, we have important matters to discuss. My sister Julia appeared in the doorway, mouthing, "I'm sorry," before taking a seat. She'd clearly been dragged along as backup. Victoria, I managed, forcing a smile. What brings you here tonight? She pulled out a chair, her red-painted nails drumming against the mahogany table. Well, darling, I've been watching, observing, and I'm concerned about my granddaughter. Stepdaughter's daughter, I corrected automatically, and Marley's fine. Is she? Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched. Working late hours at the hospital, leaving her with various sitters? A child needs stability, Edith. Flynn's hand found mine under the table. My wife is an excellent mother. Of course she tries, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. But sometimes trying isn't enough, which is why Truman and I have decided to petition for custody. The wine glass slipped from my hand, shattering against the floor. Red liquid spread across the cream carpet like blood. You what? My voice came out as a whisper. It's for the best, really, Victoria continued, pulling papers from her designer handbag. We have the resources, the time, the proper environment. Get out. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. Get out of my house. Edith. Truman stepped forward, his expensive suit catching the light. We're only thinking of what's best for Marley. What's best for Marley? I laughed, the sound harsh and foreign. You've been married to Victoria for what, 6 months? You've met my daughter twice. Julia stood up too, moving to my side. Victoria, this is insane. You can't just... I can, and I will. Victoria's smile turned sharp. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss this civilly. Perhaps over dinner next weekend? We could invite the whole family. I felt Flynn's steadying presence behind me, his hand on my shoulder. Victoria, I think you should leave. Think about it, Edith. She stood, straightening her blazer. You have until next weekend to decide how you want this to play out. Come along, Truman. They left as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and those damned custody papers on my anniversary table. Julia hugged me tight. I'm so sorry, sis. I overheard them planning this ambush, but couldn't warn you in time. I pulled back, wiping angry tears from my eyes. How dare she? How fucking dare she? We'll fight this, Flynn assured me, already pulling out his phone. I'll call our lawyer first thing tomorrow. But I wasn't listening anymore. My eyes were fixed on Julia, who was studying the papers Victoria left behind with an odd expression. What is it? I asked. She looked up, a glint in her eye I recognized from our childhood schemes. You know, Truman's not as squeaky clean as Victoria thinks. I overheard something interesting at their wedding. Flynn started cleaning up the broken glass, but I leaned forward. Tell me everything. Well, Julia glanced at the door, lowering her voice. Let's just say his perfect businessman facade might be exactly that, a facade. And if Victoria wants to play dirty, I picked up one of the remaining wine glasses, studying the way the light fractured through the crystal. Then maybe it's time I learned to play dirty, too. The anniversary dinner was ruined, but as I looked at the custody papers on my table, I felt something shift inside me. Victoria had always seen me as the weak one, the one she could control and manipulate, but she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd threatened my family, and I was done being the perfect stepdaughter. The family dinner table at Victoria's house always felt like a minefield. One wrong word, one misplaced comment, and everything would explode. Tonight was no different, except this time I came prepared. More wine, darling. Victoria topped off my glass without waiting for an answer. You look like you could use it. Those hospital shifts must be exhausting. I caught Julia's eye across the table. We'd spent hours strategizing this dinner, planning every move like a chess game. Actually, I've switched to part-time, more time with Marley that way. Victoria's hand paused mid-pour. Oh, can you afford that on Flynn's salary alone? We manage. I smiled, watching Truman fidget with his collar. Actually, Truman, how's the real estate market these days? Still booming? He coughed slightly. Oh, yes, absolutely thriving. Just closed a major deal last week. Fascinating. Julia chimed in, right on cue. Which property was that? I'd love to see some of your developments. Truman's fork clattered against his plate. It's still under wraps. Confidentiality agreements, you understand. Of course, I nodded, taking a sip of wine. Though it's strange. I was talking to Sarah from the city planning office last week. She mentioned permits being down across the board. Victoria's perfectly manicured nails drummed against the table. Enough shop talk. Marley, sweetheart, tell Grandma Victoria about school. My 5-year-old looked up from her pasta. We learned about lying today. Mrs. Peterson says it's bad to pretend to be something you're not. I nearly choked on my wine. Leave it to my daughter to deliver the perfect line without even knowing it. Speaking of pretending, Julia said casually, remember that guy at your wedding, Truman? The one who kept trying to talk to you about Milwaukee? The color drained from Truman's face. I don't recall. Oh, I do, Julia pressed. Tall guy, angry looking. Kept mentioning something about investments? Victoria's eyes narrowed. Truman never mentioned any business in Milwaukee. Didn't he? I watched as Truman loosened his tie. That's odd. I could have sworn. More potatoes? Truman stood abruptly, grabbing the serving bowl. Sit down, dear, Victoria commanded. Edith, I hope you're not trying to imply something about my husband. I met her gaze steadily. I'm not implying anything, Victoria. I'm just making conversation. Like you taught me, always show interest in family matters, right? The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Flynn squeezed my hand under the table, our signal that things were going according to plan. Mommy? Marley tugged at my sleeve. Can I go play? Of course, sweetie. I kissed her forehead. Julia, would you mind? Julia stood, taking Marley's hand. Come on, kiddo. Let's go check out that new dollhouse. As soon as they left, Victoria's facade cracked slightly. If you're trying to intimidate us out of the custody petition, I would never, I interrupted, my voice honey-sweet. I just find it interesting how quickly you're willing to trust someone you've known for less than a year with my daughter's future. I've known Truman for 3 years, Victoria snapped. Really? I pulled out my phone. Because according to his LinkedIn profile, he only moved here 2 years ago, after leaving Milwaukee rather suddenly. Truman's water glass tipped over, spreading across the expensive tablecloth. I should clean that up. Stay, Victoria's voice was sharp. Edith, Whatever game you're playing, no games. I stood up, gathering my purse. Just facts. And speaking of facts, Julia mentioned something fascinating she overheard at your wedding. Should we discuss that now, or would you prefer to hear it along with the family court judge? The silence was deafening. Flynn stood beside me, his quiet strength bolstering mine. You're bluffing, Victoria said finally, but her voice wavered. Am I? I headed for the door, then paused. Oh, and Victoria, next time you want to threaten my family, remember, I learned from the best how to dig up dirt. You taught me that too, remember? As Flynn and I collected Marley and headed home, I could feel Victoria's eyes burning into my back. But for the first time since I was a teenager, I didn't cower under that gaze. You okay? Flynn asked as we drove home. I watched the streetlights flash by, thinking of Julia's whispered revelation about Truman's past. I will be. Victoria's not the only one who knows how to play this game anymore. My phone buzzed. A text from Julia. You won't believe what I just overheard him say on the phone. Call me ASAP. I smiled in the darkness. The real game was just beginning. He said what? I gripped my phone tighter as Julia's words sank in. After putting Marley to bed, I'd immediately called her. I swear, Edith, he was in Victoria's study, talking about some investment group in Milwaukee, something about keeping them quiet and buying more time. Julia's voice crackled with excitement. But here's the best part. He mentioned someone named Rachel. Rachel? He said, and I quote, Rachel can't find out about any of this. Then he got all jumpy when he realized I was walking past the door. I paced our kitchen, mind racing. We need help, someone who knows how to dig deeper. Already ahead of you, sis. Julia paused. Remember Dominic, the lawyer who helped with Dad's estate? 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a late-night coffee shop, watching Dominic spread documents across the table. His tie was loose, but his eyes were sharp. Your sister filled me in, he said, sliding a folder toward me. I did some preliminary digging. Your stepmother's new husband is interesting. Define interesting. 3 failed businesses in Milwaukee, 2 pending lawsuits, and a marriage license from 2018 that was never officially dissolved. My coffee cup froze halfway to my mouth. He's still married? Technically. Dominic leaned forward. But here's where it gets complicated. The wife Rachel filed for divorce claiming financial fraud, then suddenly withdrew the petition and disappeared. Disappeared, moved, changed her number, went off grid, but she's still legally Mrs. Welch. I sat back, processing this. So, Victoria has no idea she's not actually married to him? Bingo. Dominic pulled out another document. And there's more. Those real estate developments he claims to be working on, they don't exist. He's been living off Victoria's money while pretending to be this successful businessman. My phone buzzed. A text from Flynn. Victoria just called. Wants us all over for brunch tomorrow. Says it's urgent. Perfect timing, I muttered, showing Dominic the text. He nodded slowly. You need to be careful, Edith. Get him to incriminate himself on record. I can help, but we need solid evidence. I have an idea. I pulled out my own phone, opening the voice recorder app. But I'll need your help setting it up. The next morning, I arrived at Victoria's house early, my heart pounding but my hand steady as I adjusted the tiny recorder hidden in my jacket. Edith? Truman's voice startled me as I walked through the garden. You're early. Couldn't sleep, I said, forcing a smile. Beautiful morning for a walk. He shifted uncomfortably. Listen, about dinner the other night. Actually, I cut in, I wanted to talk to you about that, about Milwaukee. The color drained from his face. There's nothing to discuss about Milwaukee. Really? Rachel might disagree. His hand shot out, gripping my arm. How do you know that name? I kept my voice steady, aware of the recorder catching every word. I know a lot of things, Truman, about the lawsuits, the missing money, the marriage that never ended. You don't understand, he hissed, looking around frantically. Victoria can't know. I'll lose everything. Including my daughter? That was your idea, wasn't it? The custody threat? He released my arm, deflating slightly. Victoria was worried about Marley. I suggested, I thought if we had custody, she'd be more invested in our future together. You mean more invested in funding your fake real estate ventures? They're not fake. He ran a hand through his hair. They're just delayed. Once the Milwaukee situation is handled, you mean once you pay off your debts? Or once Rachel agrees to the divorce? Keep your voice down, he pleaded. Look, I can explain everything. The investments, Rachel, all of it. Just not here. Explain what, darling? Victoria's voice cut through the morning air like ice. We both turned to see her standing in the doorway, perfectly dressed but with fury in her eyes. Victoria, Truman started, but she held up a hand. I think, she said coldly, we all need to have a little chat. As we followed her inside, I touched the recorder in my pocket, making sure it was still running. The real conversation was about to begin, and this time I had all the cards. Julia was right. I wouldn't believe what I was about to hear. But more importantly, neither would Victoria. Victoria's dining room felt like a courtroom as we sat around the table. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished surface, and my coffee sat untouched, growing cold. Start talking, Victoria commanded, her fingers wrapped tight around her teacup. What exactly did I overhear about Milwaukee? Truman loosened his collar. Darling, it's just business matters. Nothing to concern yourself with. Business matters involving someone named Rachel? Victoria's voice could have frozen hell. I sat back, letting the scene unfold. The recorder was still running in my pocket, catching every word. Rachel was a business partner, Truman stammered. Really? I pulled out my phone, sliding it across the table. Because according to this marriage license, she's your wife. The teacup crashed to the floor. Victoria's hands shook as she picked up the phone, her face draining of color. This is obviously a mistake, she whispered. No mistake. I leaned forward. Rachel filed for divorce in 2018, claiming financial fraud. Then she suddenly disappeared. Care to explain that, Truman? I can explain everything. He stood up, pacing. Rachel and it was complicated. The divorce papers got lost in the system. I meant to fix it. Lost in the system? Victoria's voice rose. We've been married for 6 months. Technically, you're not, I interjected. You can't be legally married to someone who's already married. The doorbell rang, making us all jump. Julia walked in, followed by a woman I'd never seen before. She was around my age, tired-looking but determined. Hello, Truman, the woman said quietly. Rachel? Truman stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. What are you doing here? Victoria stood so quickly, her chair scraped against the floor. This is Rachel? Julia found me, Rachel explained, her voice steady. Told me you were about to marry another woman, that you were still using the same schemes. Schemes? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Rachel pulled out a stack of papers. Investment fraud. He convinced me to invest my inheritance in his developments. Then the money disappeared. When I threatened to go to the police, he convinced me to sign some papers. Next thing I knew, my bank accounts were empty. You're lying, Truman snarled, but his face was ashen. My phone buzzed. A text from Dominic. Just got the bank records. You won't believe the transfers I found. Check your accounts, Victoria, I said softly. Check them right now. Victoria's hands trembled as she pulled up her banking app. The sound she made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. $2 million, she whispered. $2 million, transferred to an offshore account last week. I never authorized. Let me explain. Truman moved toward her, but Rachel stepped between them. That's what he said to me, too, Rachel said, right before he threatened to destroy my life if I went to the authorities. You can't prove anything, Truman snapped, but his confidence was cracking. I pulled out the recorder, stopping it with a click that echoed in the sudden silence. Actually, we can. Everything you said in the garden about Milwaukee, Rachel, the investments, it's all here. Victoria sank into her chair, her perfect posture crumbling. All this time, and you were going to help me take Marley? Use my granddaughter as part of your con. Victoria, he pleaded, you don't understand. The investments are real. They just need time. Save it for the police, Rachel cut in. I've already filed a report. They're very interested in speaking with you. As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Truman looked around wildly, then bolted for the door. Julia blocked his path. Going somewhere? She asked sweetly. The police would love to hear about those missing development permits, too. The next few minutes were a blur of police officers, questions, and Truman being led away in handcuffs. Through it all, Victoria sat silent, staring at her empty teacup. Finally, she looked up at me. You knew. You investigated him, found Rachel, arranged all of this. Why? Because you threatened my daughter, I said simply, and because, despite everything between us, you're still family. I couldn't let him steal everything from you. Victoria's carefully applied mascara left black trails down her cheeks. I've been such a fool. My phone buzzed again. Flynn, asking if everything was okay. As I typed a quick response, Rachel approached Victoria. He fooled us both, she said gently. But now he can't fool anyone else. I watched them, these two women brought together by the same man's lies, and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. The revenge I'd planned had worked perfectly, but the victory felt hollow seeing Victoria so broken. Sometimes winning doesn't feel like winning at all. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Victoria's face as she finished giving her statement. 2 days had passed since Truman's arrest, and the reality of his deception was still unfolding like a nightmare. Mrs. Diaz, the detective closed his notebook. We've frozen the offshore accounts. With Ms. Rachel's previous case and your evidence, we have a solid case against him. Victoria nodded mechanically. I'd never seen her look so small. I'll drive you home, I offered, surprising myself. The ride was silent until Victoria suddenly spoke. I withdrew the custody petition this morning. I know, Dominic told me. You could have exposed Truman immediately, she said, staring out the window. Instead, you investigated, found Rachel, gathered evidence. Why go through all that trouble? Because proving he was a fraud wasn't enough. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I needed you to see the truth about why you wanted custody of Marley. What do you mean? You never thought I was an unfit mother. You were trying to create the perfect family with Truman. A do-over, using my daughter as your second chance. Victoria flinched. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I pulled into her driveway. You've been trying to control my life since you married Dad. When that stopped working, you targeted Marley. I just wanted to fix everything, make it perfect. I turned to face her. Like you tried to fix me after Mom died? The words hung between us like shattered glass. Victoria's hands trembled in her lap. I thought I was helping, she whispered. Your clothes weren't right. Your manners needed work. Your ambitions were too small. I was grieving my mother, and you were trying to remake me in your image. A car door slammed nearby, making us both jump. Rachel emerged from a taxi clutching a file folder. Sorry to interrupt, she said, approaching my window. But you need to see this. The detective just gave me copies of Truman's financial records. Victoria tried to wave her away. I don't want to. It's not just about the money, Rachel insisted, opening the folder. Look at the dates. The first transfer from your account was made the day after Edith announced her promotion at the hospital. I frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Everything. Rachel pointed to a series of transactions. He started moving money right after you became financially secure, right after Victoria lost her last bit of control over you. Victoria's sharp intake of breath confirmed Rachel's words. He knew, Rachel continued, he knew you were vulnerable because Edith was finally completely independent. He used that to manipulate you into the custody threat, knowing it would create chaos in the family. And chaos would make it easier to hide his theft, I finished, the pieces clicking into place. Victoria's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. Stop, please. No, I said firmly. You need to hear this. He didn't just steal your money, Victoria. He stole your pride, your judgment, your relationship with your family. He used everything you ever did to control me as a weapon against you. I never meant. Victoria's voice cracked. I thought I was protecting you. After your mother died, you were so lost. I just wanted to make everything perfect. Life isn't perfect, Rachel said gently. That's what makes Truman's type so dangerous. They promise perfection to people who can't accept reality. I watched Victoria absorb this truth, saw the exact moment when her walls finally crumbled. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Edith, I'm so sorry for everything. The apology I'd waited years to hear should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt like watching someone wake from a long, dark dream. Victoria, I said softly, would you like to come over for dinner tonight? Marley's been asking about you. She looked up, surprised. After everything I did. Family's complicated, I shrugged, but it's still family. Rachel smiled, closing her folder. I should go. My flight back to Milwaukee leaves tonight. As she turned to leave, Victoria called out, Rachel, thank you for coming forward. Thank your stepdaughter, Rachel replied. She's the one who found me. She's the one who stopped him from doing to you what he did to me. I watched Rachel walk away, then turned back to Victoria. 7 o'clock, Flynn's making his famous lasagna. For the first time in days, Victoria's smile reached her eyes. I'd like that. As I drove home, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying someone. Sometimes it's about forcing them to face the truth about themselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, that truth can heal more than it hurts. Grandma Victoria, look at my drawing. Marley held up her artwork proudly as we sat around our dinner table. The tension from the past weeks had softened into something almost comfortable. Victoria adjusted her reading glasses. Is that all of us? Uh-huh. See? That's you with the fancy shoes, and Mommy in her doctor coat, and Aunt Julia with her crazy hair. Julia snorted into her wine glass. My hair is not crazy. It's artistic. Speaking of artistic, Flynn emerged from the kitchen with dessert. Who wants apple pie? The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Dominic stood on our porch, looking grave. Sorry to interrupt dinner, he said, stepping inside. But we have a situation. Truman made bail. Victoria's fork clattered against her plate. What? How? Someone posted it for him? Dominic pulled out his phone. And there's more. He's been making calls. My stomach dropped. What kind of calls? To reporters. He's threatening to go public with stories about both families unless the charges are dropped. He's got nothing left to lose. Victoria stood up abruptly. Marley, sweetheart, why don't you go show Julia your new dollhouse? Once Marley was safely upstairs, Victoria's composed facade cracked. He knows everything about my family, my business associates. If he starts spreading stories, true or not, the scandal would be devastating, Dominic confirmed. He's demanding the charges be dropped by tomorrow morning. No, I stood up, anger burning in my chest. We're not letting him win, not after everything. Edith, Flynn warned, think about this. If he goes to the press, let him. Victoria's voice was steel. I've spent my whole life protecting my reputation, controlling every detail to maintain the perfect image. Look where that got me. Dominic raised an eyebrow. You're willing to risk everything? He already took everything, Victoria replied. My money, my pride, my relationship with my family. I won't let him take my integrity, too. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Meeting. Tonight. The Grand Hotel Bar. Come alone or the press gets everything. I showed the message to the others. It's a trap, Flynn said immediately. Of course it is, I agreed. But it's also an opportunity. Dominic's eyes lit up. If we can get him to threaten you on record? Absolutely not, Victoria interrupted. It's too dangerous, says the woman who taught me to never back down from a fight. I grabbed my coat. Flynn, call the detective. Dominic, I need you to set up whatever legal protection we might need. Victoria. She met my eyes, understanding passing between us. I'll stay with Marley. The Grand Hotel bar was nearly empty when I arrived. Truman sat in a corner booth, looking disheveled but dangerous. Brave of you to come alone, he smirked. Brave of you to show your face after what you did. I sat down, placing my phone on the table. Let's cut to the chase. He leaned forward. Drop the charges, or I destroy both your reputations. Every family secret, every scandal, every skeleton in Victoria's perfectly organized closets. You really don't get it, do you? I shook my head. You think you're still holding all the cards. I know I am. His smile turned ugly. How do you think the medical board would react to stories about their rising star's unstable home life, or Victoria's business partners to tales of her family drama? Is that what you told Rachel when you threatened her? His expression darkened. Rachel was weak. She broke. Victoria won't, not unless you convince her. You're right about one thing, I said, standing up. Victoria won't break, but not because I'll convince her, because she's done letting men like you control her life. You're making a mistake, he called after me. I'll destroy everything. I turned back, smiling. Check your phone. He frowned, pulling out his cell. His face went pale as messages flooded in. Live streaming is amazing, isn't it? I gestured to my phone on the table. Your threats just went out to the detective, our lawyer, and about 1,000 social media followers. Still think you're holding the cards? The sound of police sirens grew closer as I walked out, leaving Truman sputtering threats behind me. Outside, Victoria waited in her car. Did it work? She asked as I slid into the passenger seat. Better than we hoped. I showed her the recording. He confessed to everything, including the threats against Rachel. Victoria started the car, her hand steady on the wheel. Let's go home. I believe I promised Marley a bedtime story. As we drove away, I watched Truman being led out in handcuffs through the rearview mirror. Sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is to let them defeat themselves. The courthouse steps felt endless as we climbed them the next morning. Victoria walked beside me, her designer heels clicking against the marble, her head held high despite the reporters gathering below. Mrs. Diaz, any comment on your husband's arrest? Dr. Morgan, is it true about the custody battle? What about the fraud allegations? Julia appeared at the top of the steps, waving us inside. Vultures, she muttered as we passed through security. They've been here since dawn. Let them talk, Victoria said, straightening her blazer. I'm done hiding. Dominic met us outside the courtroom, his expression grim. Truman's lawyer is pushing for a deal. He's offering to return the money in exchange for reduced charges. No. Victoria's voice was firm. He faces everything he's done. All of it. The courtroom doors opened, and there he was. Truman, in an ill-fitting suit, his confident smirk replaced by desperate anger. His eyes locked onto Victoria. "You're making a mistake," he called out. "Think about what this will do to your reputation." Victoria stepped forward, but I grabbed her arm. "He's not worth it." "Oh, but he is," she replied, then raised her voice. "You know what damages a reputation, Truman? Letting fear control your life, letting men like you make us afraid of the truth." The bailiff moved between them as Truman's face contorted with rage. "You stupid woman, I gave you everything you wanted. The perfect husband, the perfect family." "Perfect?" I stepped forward. "You threatened a child, used my daughter as leverage. There's nothing perfect about that." "Order!" The judge's gavel cracked through the air. "Take your seats." The next hour was a blur of legal terms and evidence presentations. Rachel's testimony via video link, bank records, the live-streamed threats. Through it all, Victoria sat straight-backed, unflinching as each lie was exposed. Finally, the judge spoke. "Mr. Welch, stand." Truman rose, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Financial fraud, bigamy, extortion, threatening witnesses." "They're lying," Truman exploded. "Victoria knew about the investments. She helped me move the money. She's just as guilty." "Bailiff," the judge ordered, "remove the defendant." As they led him away, Truman thrashed against the restraints. "You'll regret this, Victoria. Everything I did for us." "No." Victoria stood, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "Everything you did for yourself. And I'm done letting you take anything else from me or my family." The gavel fell one final time. "Defendant is remanded to custody pending sentencing. Court adjourned." Outside, the reporters were waiting. But before they could pounce, Victoria stepped up to the microphones. "Yes, I was deceived. Yes, I was foolish. And yes, I allowed my pride and need for control to nearly destroy my relationship with my stepdaughter and granddaughter." She took a deep breath. "But today, I choose truth over perfection. Family over facade." The cameras flashed as she turned to me. "Edith, I owe you an apology, not just for Truman, but for years of trying to control you, shape you into something you never needed to be. You were perfect just as you were." My throat tightened as she continued. "To anyone watching who thinks they need to maintain a perfect image, who lives in fear of scandal or judgment, don't. The only person you need to answer to is yourself." The reporters erupted with questions, but Victoria was already walking away, head high, heels clicking against the marble. Julia linked her arm through mine. "Well, that was definitely not the Victoria we grew up with." "No," I agreed, watching my stepmother stride through the courthouse doors into the sunlight. "This is better." My phone buzzed. Flynn, with a photo of Marley in her ballet tutu. "Someone can't wait to show Grandma Victoria her dance moves." "Coming to dinner?" I asked Victoria as we reached our cars. She smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes. "Wouldn't miss it, but first, I need to make some calls. It's time to be honest with my business partners, too. No more facades." As she drove away, Julia squeezed my hand. "You know, when you started this whole revenge plan, I thought you wanted to destroy her." "So did I admitted. "But sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. Sometimes it's about forcing people to face their truth." "And Victoria's truth?" I watched her car disappear around the corner. "That perfection is the enemy of love, and love is all that matters in the end." The courthouse steps were empty now, the reporters gone. but something remained in the air, a sense of endings and beginnings, of facades crumbling and truth emerging from the rubble. Sometimes the best revenge is letting go of the need for revenge at all. The autumn breeze scattered leaves across our backyard as I watched Victoria teach Marley how to plant tulip bulbs. Gone were the designer suits and perfect manicures, replaced by gardening gloves and casual clothes that would have horrified her former self. Like this, Grandma? Marley carefully placed a bulb in the soil. Perfect, sweetheart. Victoria smiled, actually smiled, without worrying about wrinkles or proper etiquette. Now cover it gently. Come spring, something beautiful will grow. Flynn appeared beside me on the porch, handing me a cup of coffee. Rachel called. Truman's sentencing is tomorrow. I know. I sipped the coffee, watching Victoria show Marley how to mark the planting spot with a small stick. Victoria's decided not to attend. Smart choice. He wrapped an arm around my waist. She's different now. The back gate creaked open as Julia arrived carrying a newspaper. Have you seen this? She handed it to me. Victoria's company was making headlines again, but not for the scandal everyone expected. Instead, she'd transformed it into something new, focusing on helping women rebuild their lives after financial fraud and abuse. Rachel's going to be running the Milwaukee branch, Julia said, watching Victoria and Marley work. Turns out healing and helping others heal is better revenge than anything we could have planned. The doorbell rang. Dominic stood at the front door, holding a thick envelope. Final paperwork, he said, stepping inside. Once Victoria signs these, everything's official. The company restructuring, the new foundation, everything. Victoria looked up from the garden, soil smudged on her cheek. Is that the paperwork? Let me wash my hands. We gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where this had all started with that ruined anniversary dinner. Victoria read each page carefully before signing. There's one more thing, she said, pulling out another document. I've changed my will. Edith, I'm leaving the foundation to you and Julia. You'll know how to run it better than anyone. Victoria? I started, but she held up a hand. I spent years trying to control everything, make everything perfect. Look where that got me. But you took my mistakes and turned them into something meaningful. You didn't just expose Truman's fraud. You showed me how to be better. Marley tugged at Victoria's sleeve. Can we plant more flowers now? Actually, Victoria smiled. I thought we might bake cookies first. The messy kind, with lots of sprinkles. My jaw dropped. Victoria, who used to insist on professional catering for every meal, wanted to bake cookies. Close your mouth, dear, she said, winking. Perfect manners, remember? We all laughed, the sound echoing through the kitchen. Julia started pulling out baking ingredients, while Flynn helped Marley put on her little apron. You know, Dominic said quietly, gathering his papers, when you first came to me about investigating Truman, I thought this would end in destruction. Instead, it ended in transformation. I watched Victoria show Marley how to measure flour, not caring about the white dust coating her expensive sweater. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most important lessons. And what lesson did you learn? Julia asked, stealing a chocolate chip. That revenge doesn't always mean destroying someone. I helped Marley crack an egg into the bowl. Sometimes it means giving them the chance to destroy their own facades and rebuild something real. Victoria looked up, catching my eye. The understanding that passed between us was worth more than any victory in court. Less philosophy, more cookies, Marley demanded, making us all laugh again. As the afternoon turned to evening, our kitchen filled with the smell of baking cookies and the sound of genuine laughter. No perfect poses, no calculated moves, no hidden agendas. Just family, messy and real and healing. You know what this reminds me of? Victoria said suddenly, watching Marley decorate a cookie with more sprinkles than cookie. Your mother. She used to bake with you girls like this. I was so busy trying to make you forget her, trying to remake you in my image, that I never saw the beauty in the chaos. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, flour and all. Well, now you know. Perfect is boring. Real is beautiful. Real is beautiful, she repeated, squeezing back. I wish I'd learned that sooner. You learned it when you needed to, I said, watching Marley create her sprinkle masterpiece. That's all that matters. Outside, the autumn wind scattered more leaves across the yard, covering the spots where tulip bulbs lay waiting for spring. Like those bulbs, something beautiful was growing here too. Not perfect, not controlled, but real and true and lasting. And that was better than any revenge could ever be.